The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939. As found on Project Gutenberg. Read by Julie Hoverson. The Golden Amazons of Venus, Part 7. The water dropped below the level of the door sills. The pumps sucked noisily on the last few foaming inches for a moment, and then they ceased. The inner door was opened by a sentry whose tight-fitting green uniform with its black dragon was made of dry cloth instead of dripping rubber. He wore a plumed metal helmet and carried a heavy sword instead of one of the thin water blades. "Come in, Slag," he said. "Who are these strangers?" They were in a sort of guard room, a square chamber where glass water helmets stood in long rows on metal shelves, and many weapons hung in racks on the walls. The control levers of the pumps were just to the left of the door. There were a half-dozen uniformed men standing about the room, one of them bearing the silver insignia of an officer on his chest. When Slag had given a hasty account of the coming of Jerry and the others, the officer nodded toward an inner door. "Prince Sarnak has just arrived. You will find him in the Great Hall. Take these strangers there." The sound of music and laughter and the confused babble of many voices came to Jerry's ears as soon as the far door was opened. They entered a vast hall. It was low-ceiled, as were all the waterlocked chambers of this strange place, but it was broad and spacious. Heavy stone columns carved like giant seahorses supported the roof. Patterns of seaweed and starfish and other denizens of the deep were intermingled with rearing dragons in the painted designs along the walls. The room was filled with wide tables flanked by long benches. The men and women who sat at the tables or stood gossiping in noisy groups in corners of the hall were nearly all of the green people of Giri, but there were a few escaped golden Amazons who came flocking eagerly around Clozana. In outward appearance, these green-skinned men and women were similar to folk who lived in the city overhead with their scaly masters, but there was a subtle difference. These people had none of the cowed and subjugated air of the citizens who lived above ground. There was a different look in their eyes, a more confident note in their voices, a firmer set to their shoulders. These folk had the air of free men and warriors, not slaves. A stocky and merry-eyed man caught sight of them and came striding across the hall. It was Sarnak, the man who had been tethered next to them in the field of the Dakta hunt. "Welcome to the halls of Lurala," he boomed. "We are glad to have you come to the hidden realm of the Dragon's Teeth, Hiziren and comrades. These are the outlanders from afar who freed me this afternoon so that I and a dozen more of our people escaped death at the hands of the Scaly Ones." "Thrice hail!" roared the crowd, while 100 blades flashed in the golden light. Angus McTavish wrung the water out of his dripping beard. "These look like men of spirit," he rumbled cheerfully. "I think I'm going to enjoy myself again." A little later, wearing dry clothes, the three of them sat down with Sarnak and his officers at a table in the corner of the hall. Young girls brought them dishes of fried sea urchins and broiled steaks of the grappa fish and other savory dishes. "We who call ourselves the Dragon's Teeth are outlaws descended from outlaws," Sarnak explained. "Our ancestors were men and women who never acknowledged the rule of the Scaly Ones when they overran this once pleasant land of Giri. I was born in this hidden place, as was my father before me and his father before him. We live here in the waterlocked halls of Lurala and harass the tyrants in what ways we can, and try to keep alive the traditions and glory of the old days when the dragon kings ruled in this city and the Scaly Ones were still lurking in their Vaka marshes to the westward." "Does Lanza know of this place?" "He knows that the Dragon's Teeth exist, as all rulers of the Scaly Ones have known it, but the location of our hiding place has never been betrayed." "Then," roared Angus, pounding his big fist on the table till the dishes rattled, "why don't you revolt? I'll go with you myself to strike a blow against those reptile-skinned devils up above." "Count me in too," Jerry said quietly. Angus's voice had boomed out through the big hall. It was answered by a lilting shout as men sprang to their feet. Hundreds of sword blades flashed clear of their scabbards. Only Sarnak himself remained seated, slowly shaking his head. There was a twisted smile on his broad and heavily lined face. His eyes held bitterness. "It would only be pointless suicide, Hiziren," he said grimly. "We number only about 1,000 altogether, we hunted men of the dragon's teeth, against the countless thousands of Lance's scaly hordes. It would be different if our countrymen up above could be inspired to a mass uprising, but the time is not yet. Too long have they lived under the rule of the tyrants. They are cowed. They have lost their spirit, and some of the younger ones have even become fawning satellites of the conquerors. If there comes a day when the forces of the Scaly Ones are engaged in some major war along the frontier, as in this suggested assault upon the barrier forts of Savisa that Lanza is said to be planning, then we may be able to do something. For the present, we must continue to lie hidden and bide our time." Jerry Norton was uncertain about his own course. Now that the Viking and her crew had been lost, with all hope of a return to Earth cut off, he felt hopelessly adrift. Sarnak urged his visitors to stay in Lurala. The place was a remarkable engineering feat, completely underwater and with its air constantly reconditioned and preserved. But Jerry felt restless and cramped there. Though the outlaws carried on a constant guerrilla warfare with the Scaly Ones, it was all on a small scale. Jerry felt that he would rather return to Savisa, where at least the people were free, and the Amazon warriors kept ceaseless watch on their frontiers. Clozana, of course, was very anxious to return home. "Suits me, too," Angus rumbled. "In that country they at least show proper respect for a man of my attainments." "Meaning your whiskers?" Jerry asked. "Look out, Angus," Clozana warned with a smile, idly running her slender fingers along the keen edge of her dagger. "Some Savisan princess will choose you for her husband, as I have chosen Jerry here." "I told you we wouldn't talk about that for the present," Jerry began. Clozana's hand moved swiftly as a striking dacta. The keen blade bit through the cloth of Jerry's sleeve and pinned it to the tabletop. "You'll never get away from me, Jerry," the girl said quietly. Angus McTavish burst out in a great roar of laughter. "Might as well admit you're licked now, lad. These Venusian women seem to be very strong-minded lassies." They started 2 days later. There was, of course, neither night nor day in the subaqueous halls of Lurala, but the outlaws ran their lives on a normal schedule. Sarnak supplied Jerry and the others with rubber uniforms and complete equipment, including the thin-bladed water swords in the long, feathery scabbards. "I will have you guided out to one of our exits that is a 1/4 mile offshore from the place where the Dacta hunt was held," Sarnak offered. "I thought that water was a lake," Jerry said. Sarnak shook his head. "No, it is an estuary, an arm of the Great Sea. The chemical tanks on your water helmets will keep the air pure for several days' travel, and the sentries at the last outpost will give you trained saddle dolphins so that you will make better time toward the coastal regions of Savisa." Sarnak went with them to the guard room at the edge of the water-filled passages, and personally checked over their equipment. "These are the new type of helmet with the audiphones that let the wearers talk to each other underwater," he said, touching the tiny microphone set into the curved glass. "Well, you had better start. May the dragon gods be with you." They strapped on their helmets and adjusted the valves. A uniformed guide stepped into the waterlock with them. Sarnak shook hands, saluted, and then stepped back through the door, which closed behind him. The guide lifted his hand in a signal, and a second later a torrent of water rushed out of the gratings to foam about their feet. They were ready to leave Lurala. Again they went through the maze of water-filled passages, passing occasional sentries. After a while, the character of the corridor changed. It was wider and was arched instead of square, and there was a carpet of soft natural sand beneath their feet, instead of a stone floor. "We come to the last outpost of Lurala, Hizuren," the guide said. They stepped out of the end of the passage and found themselves in the open sea, many fathoms down. A broad and slightly sloping floor of smooth sand studded with lumps of coral and clusters of seaweed stretched before them. Some were giant ferns stretching 12 and 15 feet high. Others were low and sponge-like growths. A school of tiny red fishes shot swiftly past them. Larger fish sailed majestically by overhead. The top of the water was a gleaming golden ceiling far above them, the greenish-yellow light lessening in intensity as it came down to the depths. The end of the passage was surrounded by a barrier of piled coral. outlaw swordsmen stood on guard, also armed with a sort of compressed air crossbow that shot a heavy metal needle with great force. From a corral at one side, an orderly brought 3 saddle dolphins. The big fish were equipped with rubber saddles strapped around the body and short stirrups. They were guided by a bridle similar to that used on earthly horses. As Jerry swung up to the saddle, his dolphin bucked once or twice with quick flips of his tail, then steadied down as he felt the tight pressure of his master's knees. When the other 2 were mounted, the officer commanding the outpost lifted his arm in salute. "The dragon gods be with you," he said. At a distance of 15 or 20 feet, the sound of his voice was slightly muted, but the words were perfectly clear in the earpieces of Jerry's helmet. He lifted his own rubber-gloved hand to his globular helmet and returned the salute. They rode off at an easy pace, the dolphins rising above the tops of the tallest vegetation. Jerry found that it was easy to sit in the saddle as long as he bent a little forward to overcome the resistance of the water against his chest. They were about 30 or 40 feet down. On Earth, such a depth would have been uncomfortable, but the lighter gravity of Venus made it easily bearable. Jerry glanced back. Closana was riding a few feet behind him, slender and erect, controlling her restless dolphin as easily as though she had been accustomed to such steeds all her life. Angus was grinning broadly through his globular glass helmet as he sat astride a particularly big dolphin and swung his light-bladed water sword from side to side. "If any one of our friends back on Earth could see us now in some sort of an astral spectroscope," the big Scot cried, "they'd think themselves crazy. Maybe this is only a nightmare at that. Do you think we'll wake up soon and find ourselves safe back on board the Viking?" "I'm afraid not," Jerry answered. He wondered in what part of this vast sea the twisted hulk of the Viking was now lying. All day they rode, roughly following the shoreline to the northward. Whenever it got so deep that nothing was visible below but a vast green shadow, Jerry headed inland until the tops of the sea gardens again came into view. Sarnak had told them that by the middle of the next day it should be safe for them to come above water and check their maps and put fresh chemical cartridges in the cylinders of their helmets. The scaly ones patrolled their coastline in shallow open boats, but they did not go beyond their own borders. Once Jerry checked his dolphin and then headed downward as he caught sight of something big and dark lying on the sand. The others followed him. It was the broken and rusting hulk of a spaceship, a vessel of a strange type with a name in an unknown tongue still visible on the shattered stern. The wreck must have been there for a very long time, for the sand was heaped high about it and seaweeds grew up through the open hatches. "Leaping ray blasts," McTavish said softly. "Yon craft never came from either Earth or Mars." "Probably from some far distant planet in outer space that we've never heard of," Jerry said. "Some adventurous wanderer of the interstellar regions who came to grief in this lonely spot." It was desolate and forlorn, the sight of that wrecked vessel from so long ago. It made Jerry think of his own lost command. There were clean-picked white bones of strange shape lying about on the sand. Jerry saluted, a tribute to those strange and forgotten wanderers of space, and then urged his dolphin to a higher level again. When the dimming light showed that it was dusk above the water, they rode into the 4-fathom shallows and halted in a smooth patch of yellow sand. Jerry unsaddled the dolphins and tethered them to lumps of coral where they browsed contentedly on the short vegetation. Then the 3 exiles sat down in a circle on the sand. McTavish stretched his long legs, bouncing a few feet off the ground as he did so, and then floating slowly down again. "I'll never forget this journey if I live to be older than the whole solar system itself," he said. "Also, I'm hungry." "There's nothing we can do about that until noon tomorrow," Jerry grunted. "Maybe the fasting will make you lose some of that surplus bulk of yours. But I'll admit I could do with some of that special coffee Portok used to brew in the wardroom on the Viking in the evenings."
"I'd give a lot for a drink of plain water," Closana said wistfully. "Acres of water around us and nothing to drink."
When the last of the light was gone, they lit a small lamp that Sarnak had given them. It illumined a circle some 20 feet across, a little patch of light in the midst of the utter blackness of the depths of the sea. They sat there talking for a while. Then Jerry stretched out on the sand with one arm hooked around a lump of coral to hold himself in place. He was thankful that the waters of Venus were always warm. It would scarcely have been possible to sleep at the bottom of one of Earth's oceans in this manner, even with the equipment with which Sarnak had supplied them. For a while, Jerry drowsed. The audiphones of his helmet picked up all the faint sounds of this watery world. A muffled splash as Angus McTavish stirred restlessly, the steady movement as their drowsing but apparently sleepless dolphins fed on the fields of seaweed, an occasional steady churning as some larger denizen of the deep swam past above them. Then he slept. It was well past midnight by the illuminated dial of the waterproof chronometer that Sarnak had given Jerry when he awoke. Angus was shaking his shoulder. The light had been put out hours before, and there was no illumination at all except for an occasional flash of green phosphorescence where some fish sped by.
"Either I'm an overgrown sponge," the big engineer muttered, "or there's a light shining through the water off to the west."
Jerry yawned and sat up, instinctively starting to rub his eyes before his hands bumped against the hard glass surface of his curving helmet. Some of the bits of coral around them glowed with an eerie green radiance, and a tall frond of seaweed had tiny specks of light on the tips of its constantly waving leaves. Then, far off to the left, Jerry caught a faint glow. It was hard to tell what kind of a light it was, so great was the refraction of the water, but there was something there. It was little more than a lessening of the deep gloom that otherwise surrounded them on all sides. Jerry got to his feet and picked up his rubber saddle, which he had been using as a pillow under his helmet. "We'd better investigate," he said. "Wake Clozana." They saddled their dolphins and... I just can't even say it. Oh my God. They saddled their dolphins and rode out at an easy pace, holding the big fish down with a tight rein. As they rode, the glow ahead of them became more definite. It seemed to come from a long row of 20 or more lights. Then they were near enough to see each other in the reflected glow. "It's some kind of ship," Jerry said. "Those lights are her portholes."
"It's more than that," snapped Angus. "It's the Viking! I know the lines of her stern anywhere, even in this sunken and god-forsaken spot."
The spaceship lay quietly in the soft mud of this part of the ocean bottom. All her portholes of transparent duralite were glowing with the reflected light from inside. The twisted wrecks of her helicopters were still visible on top of the hull, but otherwise she did not appear to be damaged. Jerry was in the middle as the three of them rode their dolphins up close to one of the big windows of the control room. The ship had evidently survived the fall into the water, for they could see dim figures moving about inside.
"I told you that duralite hull could stand a little thing like a fall into the ocean,"
McTavish exulted. As they crowded their finny steeds close to the glass of the control room window, Portok the Martian came to peer out. His red-skinned face went pale as he saw them, and even through the ship's hull their audiphones picked up his agonized cry. "Steve! Tanda! I just saw the ghosts of Norton and McTavish looking in the window!" Steve Brent came into the control room. He looked haggard and unshaven, and he was stained with oily grease.
"What are you raving about, Portok?" he snapped.
"It's no raving, Steve," the little Martian chattered. "I tell you, I saw the three of them, the chief and Angus and the Amazon girl, all riding on some kind of big fish and peering in that window." "You're going crazy," Steve Brent snapped, but he walked to the window. His own eyes widened as he saw the strangely clad trio sitting their mounts outside. Jerry waved violently to him. "Let us in, you idiot," he shouted, forgetting that the Viking did not carry any audiphones that could pick up his words. He heard Steve's unsteady voice.
"Maybe we're both crazy, Portok, but I think they're really out there. Open the outer door to the starboard space lock."
A small door swung open on the starboard side of the Viking's blue and silver hull. That small compartment had really been designed for dropping objects into the void of outer space, or for testing the quality of the atmosphere on any stray planetoids the Viking might have visited on her journey across the vastness of interplanetary space, but it would do for a waterlock in this instance. Jerry and the others dismounted from their dolphins and let the reins hang. Angus gave his mount a slap on the flank. With a flip of its tail, the big fish wheeled and swam off, and after a second, the others followed it. Jerry led the way into the space lock and closed the door behind him. It only took a few seconds for the blast of the Viking's powerful compressed air tanks to blow out the water. Then, as Jerry unstrapped his helmet and lifted the big glass globe off his head, Steve Brent opened the inner door and stepped into the space lock.
"I don't know if I'm crazy or dreaming or what, Chief," he said, "but I'm damn glad to see you back."
"You're sane enough," Jerry snapped. "It's a long story, so skip it for the moment. I thought you were done for."
"Not the Viking!"
Steve affectionately slapped the laminated duralite shell of the spaceship.
"She can stand more than being dropped in the drink from a few 100 feet up. Our problem is how to get going again. We've been able to crawl along the bottom by using minimum power of one rocket tube and scaring hell out of all the fish, but that's the best we've been able to do. Now that Angus is back, he could take over. What do you think about the helicopters?" "I could forge new ones in a week out of that blue metal they have in Girivaka," McTavish muttered, "but God knows how we'll ever get hold of a supply. Anyway, I think I can reverse enough of the gravity plates to give this craft reserve buoyancy so she'll navigate on the surface instead of hugging the bottom."
"I never thought of that," Steve said admiringly. Angus grunted and began to strip off his green rubber uniform.
"It takes a Scotsman to show the rest of the universe how to get out of a tough spot."
It was afternoon on the following day when the Viking's long hull finally broke the surface. She lay in the water like a half-submerged cigar, the yellowish ripples lapping on the curved blue duralite of her superstructure. The twisted remains of the shattered helicopters were ugly stumps along the spaceship's sleek back. A single rocket tube flamed and smoked astern, its blast driving the vessel through the water at a good pace while her wake smoked and bubbled. Jerry Norton opened the duralite dome of the upper control room and stepped out on the wet deck with a few of the others. They were well out on the great sea, with the green hills of the Giri-Savisa border a low smear along the horizon to starboard. This was the same lonely sea they had seen when they first dropped down through the clouds to Venus. The vast and greenish-yellow waters were broken by scattered islands, bare bits of rock that were dotted with blue moss. Seabirds swooped about them. Lofty mountains on a distant shore were capped with snow. In one or two places, a narrow shaft of sunlight struck down through a brief gap in the canopy of eternal clouds, but otherwise there was only that subdued and peculiarly golden light in which there moved only a few oddly shaped birds. So much had happened since they first saw that lonely sea. It seemed as though much more than a week had elapsed. Savisa and its golden Amazons, the arrow-tipped tower of Rupin Sang, the scaly hordes of Vaka, and the dread palace of the insane Lanza, who had once been an earthly officer, the secret and waterlocked halls of Larala, where the outlaws of Giri dwelt. Many scenes went through Jerry Norton's mind. He seemed to have aged 10 years since the day he brought the Viking down through the cloud screen. Well, the immediate problem was to get some suitable metal to repair the smashed helicopters. The Viking might possibly get up into the air with the power of her rockets alone, if they beached her on a sloping shore with her nose upward, but she could never come down safely without helicopters. "I'll hold her on this course a while," Jerry said. "In the morning we can strike over and try to pick up the frontiers of Savisa." It was just at dusk that they saw the white towers against the sky. They rose out of the sea as Jerry turned the Viking's blunt nose toward them. The mighty battlements of a vast city. Closana, who was standing on deck beside him at the time, rested her hands on the rail and stared in utter amazement.
"But it isn't possible, Jerry," she gasped. "There isn't any civilization out there on the islands of the Great Sea."
"Could it be a mirage?" he suggested. "A reflection of some Savisan city on the mainland?"
"No," the girl shook her head. "There are no cities of that sort in any of these lands. Jerry, there is something strange here. I do not like it. There cannot be any city ahead of us there."
"But there is," Jerry said grimly. "We can't all be seeing things. We'll go closer and get a better look." It was sunset, the unspectacular Venusian sunset, which was simply a swift lessening of the golden glow from the cloud-veiled sky above. Lights were gleaming from most of the tall buildings of the towering city as the Viking drove toward it through a quiet sea. Seabirds swooped low about the ship's wake. The watchers on deck could see the low shoreline of the island on which the city was built. Then they heard distant bells, pleasant bells that seemed to be chiming a farewell to the day and a welcome to the night. And then a red light flashed on top of the tallest building, and in an instant the entire city vanished.
That was part 7 of The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939, as found on Project Gutenberg, narrated by Julie Hoverson. Music is from Zephon, as found on Jamindo.